So this is the first class on Job, the introduction into the book. So first of all, a basic outline, what happens in the story. We start out with Job, who's a righteous man, we're told, and lives in a wealth, which in that day and age would mean he had a lot of animals and kids and other things. And then God has a council, and we meet, in Hebrew it would be Hasatan, which literally means the accuser. And so he and God talk, and God gives him permission to test Job's faith. So though Job loses everything, and then Hasatan and God talk again, and then the accuser goes and is allowed to make Job ill, so he becomes greatly ill. At this point, his friends come by his bedside and comfort him, and I have comfort on the outline in quotations because one could argue that they don't really do a good job of comforting him. Then in the midst of that conversation, Job asks God why this is happening. And then at the end, God comes down, gives his response. And then we, at the very end, hear that Job gets back more than he had and lives a very long life. So now, who wrote the book of Job? Well, the quick answer is we aren't entirely sure. There's two different sections of the book. There's a prose section and a poetry section. And we think, well, they're written by two different groups. We think one might have been written by an Edomite, a person from the land of Edom, very close to Israel, which you can read about a lot in the Old Testament. And we think that might have been a person from there because the prose section is set in that area. But it could also be an Israelite who is just living in the outskirts of Palestine who wrote this as well. But the key thing here is we've got a prose section, a poetry section, and we're not really sure how or when those were put together. So now for the next bit, where, or rather when, was Job written? Well, the answer is we're not sure, because there's no reference to any specific events in the book that would help us with that. We think the story of Job itself, the folklore, as some have called it, would have been pre-exilic, so it would have been before the exile of the Israelites from Jerusalem and the rest of Israel. So, and the speculation for this is because, so pre-exile, this would have been a time before the Edomites came and started to settle on some of the outskirts of Israel. And so the book of Job is very kind towards Edomites, and the thought is that the Israelites would have liked them before they started coming in still, so that's kind of where we've got the placement of this being before the exile. So that's for the prose bit. The poetry, and again, with the prose bit, it's because this, we think an Edomite wrote it because of where it was set in the city of Uz, which would have been in Edom. Now the poetry bit, we think might have been either during the exile or post-exile, possibly. And part of the reason for this is that second Isaiah, which would have been written after the exile of Israel, has some parallels with Job, so it seems like there may be a conversation going on between those two texts. But again, we just don't know. Second Isaiah, by the way, Isaiah is in 3 sections. The first part of Isaiah would have been the original prophet. Then there's a second part, and off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact chapter notes, but that would have been after the exile. And then many scholars believe there's a third Isaiah, and I would agree with them, that is after the return from the exile. And those would be the very, very later chapters of Isaiah. So diving in now to the book of Job itself, what do people often say that this book means? And some of these things I'm listing, some of them are better, some of them are worse. It kind of depends on how seriously you take one idea or the other. But these all have some merit, and there are also things that people ascribe to the book, which is why I've included them here. So some will very much focus on that the point of the book is that Job persisted. And that comes from the book of James, chapter 5, verse 11, the epistle of James in the New Testament. And the word there is upomonen. I'm hoping I'm getting my Greek right there. Upomonen, which means holding out, enduring, having patience. So patience is often the word that we focus on. And in fact, looking at that verse, and this is in the new RSV. So again, James 5:11. Indeed, we call blessed those who show endurance. You have heard of the endurance of Job. You've seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. So endurance is what's used there, but patience is often what people focus on there, that Job was patient throughout his suffering and maintaining faith, which we can debate about the maintaining faith as we get into the book further on. Another thing people say that the book means, an idea about it, is that God sometimes tests our faith. And I think we want to be careful with this too, because that can make God out into the bad guy in some ways. We could say instead that God allows for our faith to be tested, which is pretty much exactly what we see in Job and what we see with Hasatan, the accuser. Another thing that people focus on is the fancy theological word called theodicy, which comes from the Greek words for God and justice. So literally we could say that's the justification of God. The way you often hear this is in the question, why do bad things happen? Why do they happen at all? If God is all-powerful, this idea that God either can be all good or all-powerful, he can't be both. Personally, I would say that the answer to why do bad things happen if God is all-powerful and all good is because we have the freedom to choose. So it's not on God. A lot of things are on us. And then another thing, and I think there's a lot of good to this, but you can... this is an idea, too, that I'd agree with others. It can, particularly Lisa Davidson, who does the intro for the book of Job in the New Interpreter's Bible, that there's a danger to this idea, too, that the prose section is trying to make sense of the poetry section. So we get... The poetry section gets at the debate of why bad things happen. The prose tries to answer that. So the intro and the end of the book, and just skipping around for a bit, how is the book divided up? We've got the prose section and we've got the poetry section. The prose being, as I talked about earlier, the beginning, chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 13, and then the very end, 42, 7 through 17, the beginning and end. So that's the intro and epilogue to the book. Whereas the poetry section are the conversations, as I just said, with Job and his friends. But yeah, so some would argue that the prose section really makes sense out of the poetry, and I think that's a very enticing view, but like I said, as Lisa Davidson and others have pointed out, that can be very dangerous because then we forget that this is a cohesive whole and that this is the book, as my professor, Becky Wright, would always say in our Old Testament class, this is the book as it's been handed down to us, and this is what we have to deal with now, so we really do have to look at it as a unity. We can't just say, well, we can chuck this section out because it's added on later. We can't really do that. We have to take it as it is. Alright, so now for the final bit. What is the bottom line for Job, in Job? So the main thing, a question of theodicy, again, this idea of justifying God. I mean, this is a prime question that you get in the study of theodicy is, why do bad things happen to good people? And that's kind of really what we get at in Job, is that question. And we don't really get any answers. We get a lot of questions asked in this book. So, because really at the end of the day, we don't know why bad things happen sometimes. We do, and this is a bit of a spoiler alert for later on, we do know in Job, in fact, that God is with us through these times and in these times. And kind of on that note, Bernhard Anderson says in Understanding the Old Testament, he asks this question, as sort of a bottom line for Job is, what is a person's relationship with God? Which I think is a good question to ask, and does get at a lot of, particularly towards the end of Job, what we see, particularly in the conversation that God has with him. So, again, as we go through this book, we'll be talking about the questions more, and getting at those questions and seeing that Job, far from just being this is the answer to why bad things happen, and sometimes why bad things happen to good people, that it really just poses questions, poses ideas. I hope you'll find, we often say, oh, his friends are completely wrong, but I hope we'll find as we dive in closer to some of those arguments that actually, in fact, sometimes his friends say things that you may sit there and think, actually, that kind of makes sense. They'll also say things that you think, how do you think this is comforting, Joe? But again, this is really just, I really feel this book is not about, in the long run, giving us answers, although it gives us some ideas of maybe what some answers are. But it really helps us in looking at the questions and searching for ourselves for the answer to why bad things happen and why sometimes those bad things happen to good people. And that's it.